Right, should be good to go.
We're live. You ready, Micaiah?
Yes. Oh, my water.
Good evening, Augustonians. Thank you if you are returning, and welcome if you are new to Lit Friday. Lit Friday is a monthly digital program that hosts writers, philosophers, artists, and creators of the African diaspora. Just a reminder, go check out Ariana Brown's debut poetry collection, We Are Owed, that is officially launched. Ariana was with us last month for a pre-launch party, and her publication is bound to make waves. Next month, on August 27th, we have the poet Dustin Pearson, who is going to come share some work with us and then engage in conversation with me. Next week as well, the August Wilson African American Cultural Center and the Greater Pittsburgh Festival of Books are partnering to launch the For August One Act Play competition. In the interest of promoting a community of literacy, we are seeking one-act submissions from BIPOC theater performers and writers that focus on the quotidian Western Pennsylvania and Appalachia Midwestern experience. Each submission should be minimalist in production and last 10 to 15 minutes. So tell your writer and theater kin to follow both the August Wilson African American Cultural Center and the Greater Pittsburgh Festival of Books on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook to stay up to date for all the details. And now we are very excited to welcome Micaiah Johnson, the author of the debut science fiction novel, The Space Between Worlds. This is the beautiful, wonderful cover. This is an old tab.
I have the UK one, which is
oh, nice.
Yeah, it's very shiny. I'm sorry. I hope you didn't see the reflection of my messy office in that cover.
No, a messy office is a productive office. Micaiah was raised in California's Mojave Desert, surrounded by trees named Joshua and women who told stories. She received her Bachelor of Arts in Creative Writing from the University of California, Riverside, and her Master of Fine Arts in Fiction from Rutgers University, Camden. Her work has been recommended by NPR, the New York Times, and Book Riot. She is a 2021 Compton Crook Award winner, congratulations, and a nominee for the 2021 Astounding Award for Best New Writer, congratulations again. She currently studies American literature at Vanderbilt University, where she focuses on critical race theory and posthumanism. Thank you so much for making the time to be with us. We're excited to hear you read for about like eight to 10 minutes, wherever you're like comfortable.
Okay. Good thing I have a book here. No, for sure. Yeah. I don't know why. I'm so sorry about this. I thought we were heading off into conversation first. That's entirely on me.
Oh, we can do that.
Let me do. No, that's totally cool. I'm so sorry. I was just in it. Let me just grab a section that I can read from.
Thank you. We appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. No, that's 100% on me. I was vibing. This will be exciting because I just literally did just grab this book. So I happen to have one right next to me. It was Fate. Okay, so let me check my time. All right. Okay, so I'm just going to start off in this kind of early section that I tend to go to because it's a nice little encapsulation, and also because the book has a lot of spoilers, and so it's easy to kind of read in sections that have to explain things. All right, okay, so when I was young and Multiverse was just a theory, I was worthless. The brown girl child of an addict in one of those wards outside the walls of Wiley City that people don't get out of or go to. But then Adam Bosch, our new Einstein and the founder of the institute that pays me, discovered a way to see into other universes. Of course, humanity couldn't just look. We had to enter. We had to touch and taste and take. But the universe said no. The first people sent to explore a parallel Earth came back already dead or twitching and about to die, with more broken bones than whole ones. It took a lot of smart people's corpses before they learned that if you're still alive in the world you're trying to enter, you get rejected hard. You're an anomaly the universe won't allow, and she'll send you back broken in half if she has to. But Bosch's device could only resonate with worlds very similar to our own. So most of our scientists, with their safe, sheltered upbringings in a city that had eliminated childhood mortality, had living doppelgangers on other worlds. So they needed trash. They needed poor Black and brown people They needed people somehow on the wrong side of the wall, even though we were the ones who built the wall. They needed people brought for labor, people who came for refuge, people who were here before the first neoliberals surveyed this land and thought to build a paradise. People who thought this already was paradise. They needed my people. They needed me. Of the 380 Earths with which we can resonate, I'm dead in 372. I'm not a scientist. I'm just what they're stuck with. The higher ups call us traversers on paper because we use ports put in place by the last generation of traversers to download the region's information and bring it back for their greater minds to study. We're no better than pigeons, which is what they call us, not on paper. But one day, the Eldridge Institute will figure out how to remotely download information across worlds. And then I get to be worthless again. When the multiverse was confirmed, the spiritual and the scientific communities both counted it as evidence of their validity. The scientists said, look, we told you there were parallel universes. And the spiritual said, see, we've always known there was more than one life. Even worthless things can become valuable once they become rare. This is the grand lesson of my life. I'm at the base of a mountain, looking over a landscape I was never meant to see. On this earth, number 197, I died at 3 months old. The file only lists respiratory complications as a cause of death, but the address on the certificate is the same one-room shack where I spent most of my life, so I can picture the sheet metal roof, the concrete floor, and the mattress my mother and I shared on so many different earths. I know I died warm, sleeping, and inhaling honest dirt off my mother's skin. Kara, respond. Kara? That's Dell. And she's been calling me, but she's only irritated now, and I won't answer until she's concerned. Not because I like being difficult, though, like, there is that, but because her worry over a wasted mission sounds just like worry over me. Behind me, information is downloading from a stationary port into a mobile one. When it's done, I'll take the mobile one back to Earth Zero, our primary Earth, the one the others think of as real. The information I gather will be divided up into light data, population, temperature fluctuations, general news, and dark data. What is affecting their stocks that might affect ours? Or if it's a future world, a full listing of where every stock will close on a given day. The existence of the dark data is a big secret, but I don't know why anyone would care. Insider trading doesn't even sound like a crime, not a real one with blood. Kara? Stella's still just annoyed. I checked the downloads progress, 60%. Kara, I need you to answer me. There we go. I'm here, I say. There's a pause while she resets to apathy, but I heard the panic. For a second, she cared. You don't always have to leave me waiting. And you don't always have to plant me 2 miles from my download port, so I guess we're both a little petty, huh, Del? I can hear her smiling but not smiling from 196 worlds away. I've dodged the physical training for my job since just after my hiring 6 years ago. She's so uptight, you'd think she'd just report me, but forcing me on these long walks is her answer. You're wanted back. There's a file on your desk. No, I already have my pulls for the week. Not a pull, a new file. No, but I put my hand against my chest, expecting to feel a divot, some missing chunk of flesh. I want to tell her it can't be true. I want to tell her I would have known. Instead, I tell her I need an hour and I cut the link. If I have a new file, that means I have a new world. And if I have a new world, that means that Earth's me isn't using it anymore. That means I'm dead again, somewhere else, and I didn't feel a thing. I'm not sure how long I sit, staring out at a horizon that's like mine, but not. The download dings its finish, and I could traverse out from here. There's no one to see me, but I steal a little more time exploring the place fate tried to keep from me. Another me is gone. So as I walk into the valley, I'm a little more valuable walking down the mountain than I was walking up. I'm gonna jump around a little bit. Okay. I love reading this part because it was used in so much promotion that it's very much my like sing along if you know it section. Um, Reasons I have died. Reasons I have died. The Emperor of the Wasteland wanted to make an example of my mother and started with me. One of my mother's boyfriends wanted to cover up what he did to me. I was born addicted and my lungs didn't develop. I was born addicted and my brain didn't develop. I was left alone and a stranger came along. The runners came for a neighbor and I was in the way. The runners came for my mother and I was in the way. The runners came for my mother's boyfriend and I was in the way. The runners came for no one, serving nothing at all but chaos and fear, and I was what they found. Sometimes I was just forgotten. In the shed where she kept me while she worked or spun, and in the length of her high and the heat of the sun, I fell asleep, alone and hungry and forever. Reasons I have lived. I don't know, but there are 8. Now I'm just gonna jump past the spoilers. Chapter 2 is a doozy, man. And I will read. Ooh. Okay, so all you need to know really for this section, you've already kind of been introduced to Dell. All you really need to know about this section is that kind of Dell has lost an earring and there's been like this kind of annoying company meeting that Kara has had to go to. You already kind of know this, but there's like a lot of anxiety about losing this job and being downsized. So this is during the meeting. Adam Bosch is excited and it makes the air a little excited too. He's talking about impending breakthroughs. And while he doesn't name the project, we all know it's remote downloads. The analysts are celebrating because the technology is so close, he can promise it is months, not years off. And sure, they're excited because now data retrieval will be instantaneous and maybe not monthly. But they're also excited because if it happens, traversers will be gone. And what are pigeons but an infestation anyway at the end of the day? The last part of Adam's speech is cryptic, but I've already stopped listening. Whatever it is, I probably won't be around when it happens anyway. After we're dismissed, I grab an armful of free food to go with the rations I've already brought from home. Dell doesn't quite meet my eyes as she readies me, just like everyone looked away from me in the hall. I'm officially Eldridge's dead girl walking. I grab my backpack after she loads me up, and she sighs. Are you smuggling extra food again, she says. I saw you shoving all those Danishes in there. Consider it my severance package. Kara, what? Are you going to tell me my job's not on its way out? There were maybe 6 traversers in there, Dell. 6 for our whole sector. They're scaling us back. Them, she says. They're scaling them back. You're more valuable than all the rest. You'll outlast them all. Well, the last of a species still dies, Dell. It's just a matter of time. It will be okay, she says. And I snap. It will be okay is such a wily thing to say, such a wily thing to even get to believe. How? Will you make it okay, I say? Take me in when I get my slip, marry me when my residency is void? Her breath comes up short at that, like I said something offensive. And it must be, to her. I want to remember this borderline disgust at the idea of an Ashtown girl. But for some reason, I can never keep it in my head long enough to stop wanting her. I reach into my pocket and pull out the Eldred sample bag containing her earring. Not the one she lost, but its otherworld cousin, so she'll never know the difference. I found this on my way home yesterday. She snatches it like a child and holds it to her chest. The reaction is rare and human, and I let myself stare because it's the closest I'll ever get to her holding me like that on this world. She looks up and catches me staring. And there's this moment between us. It's like a snap into focus where all at once she sees me, She finally understands that all of my flirting is just hiding in plain sight, just being so obvious. She'd never guess that she's the one thing on this world that I know and all that I want. But then it happens. She looks, for just that first moment, afraid. The universe is brimming with stars and life, but there is a section of sky that is utterly dead and empty. They call it a cold spot, a super void, and they say it got that way because two parallel universes got too close to touching. That's us. That's me and Dell. We coexist, parallel but never touching, and if one of us goes too far, if I ever get too close, the Eridanus void opens up between us. We both withdraw and leave a darkness in the space where we almost touched that 3 suns couldn't light. I tried to sell it, but it's worthless without the other one, I say. And she half smiles, but it's really a negative smile. It's the saddest thing I've ever seen. I start climbing the ladder into the hatch before she can say anything else, because if I stare at her much longer, this woman who wants me, but is too afraid of where I'm from to do anything about it, I might finally find a way to hate her. And I don't want to. Not really. Not yet. And then I guess I'll just read this last section if I have the time.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, okay. It's just a little Ashtown background. All kinds of refugees. That's what Ashtown is made of. Those fleeing religious persecution came with a little money and a lot of faith, and generally settled on the edge where the sand was more white than gray, so they could pretend it was the promised land. 100 years after that, those who fled from poverty and drought followed rumors of water and work building the city. Maybe they believed that once that last shining skyscraper was finished and there were still plenty of vacancies, they would be let in. I doubt they would have built the wall so sure and high if they'd known which side of it they would be on. The builders' descendants became factory workers, less proud but just as efficient, until the factory was no more. Now the factory workers' children work for Eldridge's industrial hatch, transferring materials from one world they'll never see to another. A couple centuries after the building boom faded, those seeking refuge from war found Ashtown. They went to the city, wanting a place with walls and defenses. They insisted they'd been promised aid. But the progressive Wiley city only keeps the promises it makes to itself. It is loving and nurturing and socialized, but only within its own borders. And so those hiding from war were left outside the walls, and the war followed. The infighting continued for a generation until Nick Sr. stopped it in the way that a lion stops infighting among gazelle. When the dust settled, the new emperor was on top, challengers dead or exiled. He opened his mouth, blood still dripping from his jaws, and declared peace.
Thank you so much. I have so many questions. Sabrina Ventrella, who's one of our attendees, said such beautiful writing, and that is definitely right, Sabrina. It is such beautiful writing, and the flow of it is also just incredible, and it just helps the story kind of come together, and the information when you read it just kind of passes like into you without a challenge because the language that you use is so beautiful. And one of the first things that I think about when you are reading and from Kara or reading Kara's narrative is thinking about how the Black woman's perspective is how we're seeing this world. And it's the Black woman's perspective through which we get ideas as to how to make the world better or make a different world. And this reminds me of so much critical race theory that's been written by Denise Ferreira da Silva, Sylvia Winter, Alexis Pauline Gumbs, and what they're all talking about is how, because the Black woman has never been adequately considered in Western world, like Western societies, such as in Europe or in the United States or in any of the Americas or the Caribbean, really, because her perspective has never been adequately included. It is the perspective, right? It is the life experience that can imagine a new way to be, a new way to live, and also kind of, I guess, like, not be an example or teach, because I think that's heavy, right? But it's the way of—
That's work.
it's work, right? It's the way that we manage to live extravagantly despite, right, that can provide insight onto how the world can be better for everybody. But then I think of that weight, right? Like that weight of responsibility. I think of Simone Biles and Naomi Osaka, and them just not, they just refuse. They're like, absolutely not, right? They decide to take their rest and take their space for themselves. And I wanted to know what's behind Kara, right? How did you formulate her as a character, build this amazing perspective? Because it's so kaleidoscopic, right? Like she gives so much to the story.
No, and I just want to, like, hopping off of what you said at the beginning, just that the position that Kara occupies as both Black, female, queer in this space is a space from which she sees the world clearly as it is. And I think that the issue that I had was so much, 'cause I used to read like old head sci-fi, like when I was growing up. And so often what you have is like the Captain Kirk type, right? You have the explorer coming from the utopian city into this weird desert of like, you know, vaguely, basically indigenous people who are like coded as alien. It's this whole issue in science fiction, but it's like you have the white male coming into these brown places, and they are the viewpoint through which you see that world, and that can never be an accurate viewpoint. And yet that is the viewpoint that we get so often in these stories, and in the viewpoint of like not just in the stories, but in our actual world, that is so often, right, the narrow viewpoint that we get and are presented with. And so the idea of like, no, like instead what we're going to have, the traversing and the moving through and the examining you like a scientist that's going to happen is going to be from somebody who is in that desert, who is in that world. Like it's the people who are there who know how to see that world and the intruder, who knows how to see both, right? That, you know, the double consciousness, right? Who's able to see both what they are and also you seeing them, and like that kind of move. So for me, that's the most powerful narrative position. And so I think that's really, really important. And I think it's also important that there are blind spots, right? Like Kara's history comes with a lot of blind spots. There are people that she cannot see clearly because of her history. And I think that that's very important. What I love about a question I get asked often is like, oh, you know, you left your small desert town. Like, are you Kara? And I always say, I wish, because Kara is much, much braver than I am and much, much smarter than I am. And she just kind of is always watching, and she's always taking these things into account. But that's a survival mechanism, right? You have to know what everybody else is doing. You have to know what those are in power are doing if they hold your fate in their hands.
Hypervigilance is a trauma response.
Hypervigilance, yes. And so it's exactly that, to where it's like, it's not the Sherlock thing where, oh, he just has a thing where he can notice all these things. It's not, you know, that Doctor House where we have these characters that are so held up for this. This is a reaction to being in the shadow of the dominant. This ability to see every detail, to notice what everybody's doing. Oh, you say this word and not this word, bet I'm going to change that. You wear these clothes and not these clothes, got it. You know, we all are doing this. We were talking a little bit before camera went live about being in academia, and that is a process of gathering costume work, right? You're gathering language, you're gathering clothes, you gather these different things. You're like, oh, these are references. And it's basically the same kind of work that we all kind of do, is what Kara's doing. And it's very much what people praise those Sherlockian characters for. Only for us, it's second nature, and it is inherent, and it's something that we do for survival. That was a long rant. I hope it answered your question even a little bit.
No, you answered my question. And then I'm also like interested in the sleight of hand. In my experience with sci-fi, the part for me also as a writer that always mystifies me or seems like magic is that part where I'm in the world and I understand it, and I don't even know that I learned the world, right? And I always wondered what that thing was. And in reading The Space Between Worlds, I realized how you were able to take our current crises, right? Racism, the environment, misogyny and misogynoir, anti-queer sentiment, anti-trans sentiment. And I noticed that you were able to take those current crises and show throughout this narrative how our future may look worse despite our technological advancement if we do not rectify these major crises, right, that we have of our time. And how did you, that's big, right, to sit down as a writer. And I don't know if you know beforehand that you're going to tackle it or if it just happens, but how did you manage to weave that thesis into the world, that proposition?
Like there are definitely some things that I have to thank whatever person is in the back of my brain for. What I did know up front, it's like, what are the things when you're world building? I think the attraction of writing like science fiction and fantasy is you can do whatever you want. And so you really have to put what limitations you're going to put on your world. And so I knew that I wanted a world where straightness was not presumed. And I didn't want that burden of educating like the heteronormative gaze. So for me, I wasn't going to bring like homophobia into Ashtown. I was like, you know what? That's something I'm going to leave. And my world is not going to have that. But I am absolutely going to bring capitalism. So it's like, that was something that I'm just like, that is a controlling factor that, I mean, I guess Wilderson said it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. But also I feel like there are lessons to be learned from this, right? And so that was one of the things, like if you're going to have the ability to go through all of these worlds, what are going to be your inhibitors? And for me, it was like that fun role that I put in where you can't go in if you're still alive, and capitalism, who would have that power? The fact that I wrote this, not realizing that it was going to be released about 9 months before a billionaire space race was just on me, right? But it's one of those things where it's like, this is what I envision being in the future. And so that was the big issue with this like billionaire space race happening. So many people like, oh, how far in the future is this? It's kind of ambiguous as to where it is. And for me, it is happening now somewhere. There is no fantastical element with the exception of the literal traversing process. Mm-hmm. There is no part of this dystopia, utopia collide that isn't happening somewhere currently right now. What I'm doing is I'm not collapsing time, I'm collapsing geographies, right? So many people who have read the book have been like, oh, I know you went to this place because this is this place. They see that desert, the poverty being kept out by this like super great city configuration. And I've had people say, oh, this is how I knew that you've been to Brazil and you've driven from the airport to the downtown. I have not been, but it's one of those things where it's like, but I know that configuration because it replicates itself. Capitalism is a replicating entity. So we've seen that over and over again. People say like, oh, this is this place in the Middle East. This is this place in South Africa. No, this is everywhere all the time. So I'm collapsing geographies. I don't think I'm working very far in the future at all. I think I'm talking about right now. And while we don't have, a billionaire who wears the same clothes, I don't think I was very subtle in my like kind of Steve Jobsian jabs with this dude, with Adam Bosch. But now it's just like, oh yeah, there's this billionaire who's funding multiverse travel for his own ego formation, looking out over, all of this inequality. And I didn't go big enough because I didn't know there was going to be a 3 billionaire space race. I was actually quite conservative in my estimation of the kind of ego formation of capitalism in crisis. I didn't know it was going to happen during a pandemic. All of the things that I would have told myself if I were writing a book of this year, that's ridiculous. Nobody's going to do that during a pandemic and like record high unemployment numbers. No one's going to have billionaires go into space. Like I couldn't write that. No one would buy that from me as reality.
I mean, Marvin Gaye wrote Inner City Blues and he talked about Man on the Moon, and then Gil Scott-Heron wrote Whitey
on the Moon.
Right, exactly. And so it's like thinking about the commentary, right? Like if there are so many people suffering at home or on your planet, it's not to say that scientific innovation should stop, but it is to say that we need to have a consorted conversation about how capitalism is not interested in taking care of thinking of caring for people who are experiencing social ills and then attacking the social ill, right? We're programmed to attack the group of people, to attack the person that's suffering, instead of understanding how we live in a situation, in a circumstance, right? A historic circumstance where, I mean, definitely constructed, right? I don't want to take any responsibility away from how this came to be. It's definitely on purpose, but it's a circumstance that keeps reproducing that through ignoring how we can resolve the problem. And then we have the glamour of Jeff Bezos going to zero gravity flight and all the news stations making it seem like he actually like left, like absolutely like beyond like one of our outer atmospheres. And it's like, that didn't happen. But we have 2 questions from the audience. And so we have a question from an anonymous attendee. And the question goes, the complexity of the relationships between Wileyites and the nuances of Ashtown, all the different pushes and pulls, how were you able to make that complexity so easily understood? the dominant viewpoint of binary perspectives is so prevalent in almost all sci-fi. There's very little relationship nuance in other works of sci-fi. Were there any influences that helped plot and develop this perspective of relationships?
I just want to say I stand on a lot of shoulders. I've been recently rereading some Octavia Butler, and there's nobody who wants you to question your binaries like Butler. You know, you're going to be like, oh yeah, here are the two, but also we're going to be doing some stuff here and some stuff over here. So I am, again, like incredibly fortunate to come from this age and to come at a time where, you know, I get to even be writing at the same time as a Corafor or Jemison, Nalo Hopkinson. Like these are people who, again, and I think Hopkinson especially does really, really good work of dealing with that mystical in between. The binaries for me, where it's not just people binaries, but also the binaries of science and magic, like all of these things of allowing these nuances. Probably my favorite thing, and I think one of the reasons it becomes easy to receive is I think these are things that we see in our world and are familiar to us. So there's a character that comes later on in the book that I named Carrington, which I did not know was a real name. I was like, I don't know, I'll make up something rich people are named. It's Carrington. And just the fact that there would be Wileyite who would emulate Ashtown style. It made perfect sense to me. But so often in these books where we have us versus them, it's a perfect separation. And there's them, and there's no cultural transfer. And the dominant resents the lesser with no cultural take-up. That's never been a model of colonialization we've ever seen. Yeah. And so of course there would be people who would like dye their skin, like try to make their hair dark, have fake teeth, wear white dreads. Oh wait, sorry, that's not the book. I'm sorry, I don't know who said that. But like there would always be that presence. And so like kind of like that, where if you see it in the world, or if you're dealing with a model of power that does exist in your world, then you do have a model of how that power would work. It may not exist in the same kind of classifications that you have it in your world. It may be delineated by magic as opposed to money or something along those lines. But if you see how this powerful entity works, then it wouldn't work in a different way. So something that always bothered me, where you have that clean cut, where it's just like, we totally don't take anything from you guys. We resent you. You're lesser than us. You're purely labor. And that's never been it. There's always been that kind of cultural uptake and liberal economy alongside the physical labor that they take.
It's a disappearing act, right? So the appropriation
exactly.
of culture from a group that is dominated is a way to exotify that group, but also disappear them and to claim that they don't produce anything through just saying, oh, well, this is just like a fad, a style that's passing, but also not want to cite where, right, you get those influences from. We have another question from Adi Peshkes. There are so many interesting, unique aspects to the world in your book: dimension hopping, environmental destruction, a world without guns. Did these all come to you specifically for this story, or did you pull ideas from separate stories together to create this one?
This was all for this story. I'm one of those people that like works on one thing and everything kind of like goes into that thing that I'm experiencing. I originally started this book in October of 2016. That was a plan. I was like, I'm just going to write this through. And then after November of 2016, I didn't write for like a couple months, at least. And so I do not know if the language of if the emphasis on citizenship and the emphasis on border walls would have been present had that not been our 2016. I don't know if that kind of like that idea of citizenship and like trying to get it, all of that became so forfeited. It probably would have been. I'm from Southern California, so that's kind of a constant conversation. That's kind of particularly, it goes hand in hand with the desert landscape. So it probably would have, but it was certainly at that time like so overbearing, and it was all border wall for so long that I feel like that must have been in the stew that then came out, that I would be the person who can't take a hint and instead makes a person who can like go through those borders and traverse all of these things. And at a time when there was so much movement restrictions to people who were culturally different from the dominant, I would like make the character that's like, oh, I can't just go through borders, I can go through worlds. Like I'm stubborn like that. So it felt very much, a lot of what I write feels like it takes this and then makes it something that I can live with in the text.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite things I read in the spring was from Sarah Ahmed, who's she's also like a critical race and gender theorist. And she said, if there is a staunch series of rules made against it, it means that it's unstoppable and probably more natural than the rule that's set against it. And so when you talk about people migrating and traversing and trading between worlds and communities, there is always someone who can do that. There is always someone from that terrain that knows that terrain better than the people dominating it, and they know the way through, right? And that's always such a sign of like, not passive hope, but very active hope, right? It's in our human code to traverse and to move and to migrate. But thinking about this idea of serendipity, right? The border wall is happening. Jeff Bezos does whatever he's gonna do. He goes to space. And all these things happen, but there are also lots of things happening in the scientific community. Physics, like theoretical physics, is taking a strong hit right now from hard scientists that are like, what are you doing in the lab creating all of this theory about a brown multiverse, parallel universes, and string theory? There was a major conversation in Nature where someone was like, this is useless. Or thinking about other things that are going on in terms of just the world that we live in. And so, how am I going to say this? You say that you can do whatever you want, but very particularly in this book, there are certain things from the theory that you take and you use that literal, theoretical physics as your rules to shape the world, while also revealing how those rules for theoretical physics are reflections of our social ails. Could you talk more about that research and thinking about like something like theoretical physics through a lens of like critique? Because this is the direction that a lot of critical race theory is going. Catherine McKittrick just published Dear Science, where she's talking about all of the issues that come with Western epistemological analyses and science perspectives. So could you talk about how you did that? Like, I know it took a lot of research, but like how you did it, but also how you felt about it.
Yes. No, at the time I felt great. So I'm absolutely love that, because the idea, the place is absolutely there to turn to like so many theoretical physics and to look at the pedestal that they're on and the kind of thing. And this is actually a conversation that's happening in science and science fiction, right? So I'm going to quote from Noah Hopkinson here, where like that very politically motivated hard science, soft science fiction division, right? Typically, if you're Black or brown, they put you, or female, God forbid, then they put you in this like soft science fiction, because if it doesn't have like a written out formula, you're not hard science fiction. But of course, science. So the idea of holding that up, right, is holding up a science that has a very different relationship to the rest of us, right? So Noah Hopkinson always said, like, my scientists were the ones working in these, we're the ones working in like the magics and arts, like that is science. This separation is a clonal separation. Like what you call science, like we would call like Tuskegee is science, like Henrietta Lacks is science. Like your science is like putting Sarah Bartman on a pedestal and calling it science, and so it's like that kind of cruelty and that kind of harvesting from Black and brown bodies is science. And so the idea of upholding that at all is not something that I'm good with. And so I like the idea of treating theoretical physics like poetry and treating theoretical physics alongside every other art. And so that's why like I enjoy that in the book of, it's this or it's this. It's just faith like everything else, and having and forcing that conversation and kind of delegitimizing it. I have way too many epigraphs. I love epigraphs. That's like my sin, to where I go from like a very hard science. I go from, I think, Brian Greene, but I mean written for the public. So I'm not going in, but just like, so I go from like figures like Brian Greene. I think I have Michio Kaku in there. And then I slowly go, and then I go to Ocean Vuong. I think I added Jeanette Smith, to where there's this gradient, right? There's a move in the logics of the text, and the logics hold equally. Like they're all saying true things that apply to the world, and you can have truth in the world, and they hold equally. Right. So they are every bit equally theories, and they are every bit equally science, if you will, truths of the universe, as much as anything can be true. So I have this thing. And so now that we're in this kind of I feel like the talk of science, then the incorrect uptake of this is what I'll say, is for something like what you were talking about, right? So then hard science comes in and says, oh yeah, you guys are fake because we're real. Because there's no, even that, like hard science and theoretical is exactly the same arbitrary distinction, right? As long as a person is reading your data is poetry to me, right? There's all of these kinds of, very, very movable things, like the idea that there is a single, like, colorblind statistic, the idea that there is anything in science that you should not be suspect of. That doesn't mean like don't trust science, and we've had quite a bit of that talk recently too. But what that means is if you are aware of your contaminated position, then you have the possibility of seeing that in your outcomes and correcting it. But if you are falsely believing in your own kind of, oh no, I'm a real science and an objective one, then you are opening yourself up to replicating all of these mistakes, right? Mm-hmm. And we're just now seeing, I'm thinking a lot of like racist algorithms and all those things, where it's people who presupposed this objectivity in coding and science that then replicated all these terrible things. So if we just have that talk, where you are is not objective. There is no like safe bubble of pure empiricism inside science. If you acknowledge that doesn't throw science away. It offers an opportunity for correcting the outcomes that you are putting out. So my goal is not to like get to I think that we have a lot of rhetoric about like all scientists are lighters, like don't trust us. Like we have this kind of rhetoric in the air right now, but it's not offering a corrective. It's just like offering like a tear down and kind of a fear, where it's just like, if we could at least admit that the place from which you stand is contaminated, the place from which you stand is contaminated by your specific position, by your very standing there, then we might be able to correct that, right? In the same way that we were seeing with coding, we're seeing with algorithms, and we're seeing with all of these things that we're also presupposed to be free of these kinds of influences. Nothing is. And so that's what I would like. So I am very much in conversations with theoretical physicists, but that conversation, I will throw that at anybody, the hard sciences who are then coming from the theoretical physicists. And I will absolutely say that because it's so frustrating to see that instead of saying like, oh, this is true of them, well, fine, but no, but this is actually, so what, instead of admitting that like all things are contaminated by ideology, instead they just want to move the bubble, where it's just like, this is science. It's like, oh, well, yeah, these theoretical guys, you're right. They are doing some weird stuff. So they're over here. We're real science. And instead of just accepting that, no, it's all, just accept that that contamination goes throughout. And then you have the opportunity of actually doing better work because you can be corrective. I have so many long science rants.
Or
it's
even
a whole
thinking about
thing.
now that we're all vaccination minded, thinking about how vaccines ended up being developed from
who's
people
missed,
who
right?
owned enslaved Africans saw inoculation and they chalked it up to some kind of magic and maligned it and wrote it really negatively until they started seeing the disappearance of certain viruses and bacterial infections because inoculation was being practiced and is a West African and Central South African practice that's a medicine. And then it went from being magic to being vaccination, right? And all of a sudden, the history of the development between those two things ends up being really, really hard to find.
I think vaccinations are a really good point for this conversation because it offers an opportunity for nuance, where it is that thing where it's like, okay, we're not going to say all science is good, all science is great, but obviously like we're pro-vaccine. I don't want to put this off on you, but like certainly like yay for vaccinations in this moment, right? However, if we blindly say that science is good, then we're not asking, oh, how are these vaccines being developed and with whom in mind? Are these being developed with Black bodies in mind, with fat bodies in mind, all of these different things. So I think that like that suspicious progressive is the exact place you want to occupy. Don't blindly uphold anything, but absolutely like vaccines are a good thing, but also like look at how capital's been working in these vaccines, right? Look at how these patents were tried to get pushed through. Vaccines can be a social good and you can still be suspicious of the pharmaceutical apparatus. Like that kind of nuance is possible. So I never want to come off like an anti-science stance. My stance will always be like just holding up kind of a mirror to where it's just like love vaccines, but saying I love vaccines doesn't mean like, oh, pharmaceutical companies were fine in everything that they did. No, like there's a lot of like capitalistically motivated shady practices afoot. And so I think being able to hold both those things in our heads is hopefully the discourse of the future, because this idea of just barking like one way or the other, it's like, no, like this is a really good example of just like, yeah, it's really shady to try and profit astronomically at a time like this. Vaccines are good, but also look at how these practices were also unfolding alongside.
Right. And if anybody's looking for like a very robust history on Blackness and medicine, read Medical Apartheid by Harriet Washington. She is also a writer that can get you through the content like cutting warm butter, and you will get from the beginning of those 400 pages to the end before you know it. So Medical Apartheid by Harriet Washington.
And you will trust nothing ever again.
We also have another question from Addie. And so there are a lot of conversations happening right now in online writing circles, book, Twitter, etc., around the topic of inclusion and staying in your lane. Do you have any advice for writers, both those in marginalized populations and those not, about writing inclusive fiction? And this makes me think of Toni Morrison, where she says, write what you don't know, was her advice, right? And how people have a lot of questions about that. So what do you think of this conversation?
Man, you guys are just trying to get me in trouble. I'm just running my mouth to the whole.
Everyone is like posting amazing questions. You guys are
between
like
us. This is just between all the people here. It's like quite certain. So here's the issue that I always have when people say like, is there a class I can go to for writing the other? Or how do I write, if you're saying, how do I write XYZ character? And so for me, if you're coming to me to figure out how to write XYZ character, then I can only presuppose that you do not have XYZ character in your life. And that makes me nervous. So Alexander Chee has this amazing quote that I'm about to butcher in real time, but it has to do with the rooms that you're in. And so they basically continually tapped him to do a, will you host our diversity issue? Will you host our diversity issue? It's like, well, why don't you just do that yourself? Why don't you just find these readers, these kind of writers all, year long? And they say, well, you're in rooms that we are not in. You're in rooms that are populated differently. And that may be true. But remember that the rooms that you're in, like those are your friends, those are your colleagues, but it's also the TV that you watch, the books that you read, the music you listen to, what you're interested in, what documentaries are you watching, like all of these things. So if it's like, oh, how do I go into a class to tell me how to write, like, for example, like an Asian woman, it's like, well, do a 360. I mean, there's an entirely possible that you live in a place where these things are not accessible. But again, those rooms are populated however you want to populate them. And if I've learned anything from moving from Southern California to the Northeast, it's that a lot of segregation is willful and it happens very quickly. Like you do not realize what you're doing when you're doing it, but you are curating your rooms unconsciously. So that's my only thing. It's like, what's motivating you? If it's like, oh, I was raised around this culture, I'm super into it, and I have these people, I have these sources, then I get that. Then like we're constantly, like we're very much this kind of society where we interact. I'm from Southern California. Like I have so much kind of like, there's so much Mexican El Salvadorian influence in so much of what I do simply because of that's the neighborhood from which I come, right? I am not, but still it's like one of those things where I understand being around these influences and having that. But I also know like who I would go to check myself in those situations. And so in the absence of having that in your circle, like I'm also a big fan of sensitivity readers. Get them, pay them, listen to them. I'm a huge fan of sensitivity readers. I've used them in the past. So that is like, I guess, the kind of safer answer that, do your research, get some sensitivity reader, blah, blah, blah. Like read the books, do the work, and imbibe in the culture and get your sensitivity reader before you take on that writing. But also think to yourself about, if you've encountered these people, why are they not in your circle? Why are they just the people you talk to at work and not the ones you actually hang out with? And so that's always my thing, where it's like you're maintaining your own kind of structures and you want to pepper in a dash of color, but what it actually means is changing the structure, right? We have this issue with diversity and inclusion in like the institutional space, where it's like, oh, that means bringing people in to this kind of maybe antagonistic white supremacist structure. It's like, no. To really do that, you change the structure and then these things proliferate. And so look at the structure of your life, and are you structuring your life in such a way that you can only bring in some pops of color, or are you living your life authentically in which these lives will proliferate around you? So that's always kind of my question, was like, when you'd rather take a class of how to talk to, like how to be this person, I'm always just like, I mean, I don't know, maybe you live in the middle of nowhere and fine, read the books, get your sensitivity readers, blah, blah, blah. But it is a bit.
Something a writer friend told me is to ask yourself what your stake is in the character that is not a part, does not reflect your identity is. Is your stake in this character enough that you are willing to go read like 4 or 5 really in-depth books that recently published about that culture, about those people, it's written by those people from different perspectives. So even if you're in an environment where you don't have contact because you're isolated, your stakes can still be that you're willing to learn and to waylay the process of your creation to actually get some kind of a reference or find ways to expose yourself. So if your stakes are not enough that you are willing to learn something in depth, then that means that you're using the character as a racial or gendered foil, something to reflect back something else in your story instead of actually adding anything in particular to the character's life and thinking about that character deeply. Because even in your character Carrington, who's supposed to be like very rich, very from where he's from, very much like clueless as to any other way of life, by the time we finish this book, we know some pretty intimate details about him that he kept repeating over and over again to Kara while talking with her. And even that character, which could be said to be like one of the less complex ones, has some complex personal information about him because he's just been thought through as a human being first before adding on all the other stuff. And so I
do want to add just real quickly, that stake thing that you said, so brilliant. And make sure that the stake that you have in this identity that is not yours is that you can do things to them that you would not do to yourself. And the reason that I have this is I've said this before, where it's like when the blood on the page isn't yours, you spill it a little too freely. And I've had this, if you've been in a creative writing workshop, this has come up with like male writers writing rape scenes for female characters, where if it's not a terror or an experience you have, you tend to go too far. You tend to be incredibly grotesque. You tend to like go as far as you possibly can. And I'm saying too far for my personal metric. I know it's art, whatever rules, but it's one of those things where when the blood's not yours, you tend to be more graphic. You tend to be a little freer with it. So if the stake in the investment, and I'm thinking particularly of this book, and I'll name names because he's huge and fine and he's never gonna hear from me, T.C. Boyle's Tortilla Curtain, where if your investment is to have a white couple and a brown couple, and the white couple gets their car stolen one time and the brown couple gets assaulted, 2 rapes, beaten up, all these things just to show, because this is where you can have your violence. If your investment is having somebody to kill off because without losing a character you actually value, like those stakes are important, but also how you're distributing pain and suffering when you use identities that are not yours is also incredibly important.
Right. And so another question that I think is important, and it's a question that I ask often, is, you know, this is your debut novel and it's in a genre, right? Because I don't really believe in like, you know, I'm a hybridist myself, right? So to say that this is genre fiction because it's, you know, sci-fi / kind of mystery, or to say it's literary fiction when absolutely it would be to me is kind of pointless, right? But as you're working as a writer, developing, getting your book deal, or even working on this project, what was the path from creation to publish like? What was your most difficult time with that? And how did you decide to keep going?
Oh man, let's get real. First of all, my stroke of luck, my absolute lifesaver is that I had an amazing agent and I got her early. Karen Mickler, Donald Mass, shout out. I think she's taking clients. I don't know. She's amazing. But so this is my debut novel. It is not the first novel that I've written. It is not even the first novel. So it's not the novel I got Cameron with. The novel I got Cameron with was worse. But also there were issues that I had as a sensitivity reader. And so it was at the same time that Cameron was like, oh, I'm not sure how we're gonna do this market. And I was seeing notes back from my sensitivity reader. I'm like, you know what? Like, I'm screwing up and I need to not, I just need to go back. And so I made the decision to pull that first book that I got my agent with and to not do a revision and to not go back on the market with it, because it's like, I would rather write something new than to possibly do this kind of harm. And I think that is, that's what that's the correct move, right? If your sensitivity reader is telling you like, you'd have to delete this character or redo it, then you're messing up. Take a step back, take some breaths. And so then I write this one second. So the other thing is I feel like I'm a very difficult sell, right? I was like, it's kind of this. And as you say, it didn't really have clean comps is what we have, where it's the books your agents will pull to tell editors about it. It didn't really have that very cleanly. It was very cobbled together, and she's an angel and she was able to make this happen, and we actually had a fairly successful like time out with it. But it was one of those things where it's quite difficult, and by design, like as I get further and further into the story, I can now, like, it's officially been announced that there will be another book in these worlds. It becomes more and more like I like tricking people. If you've read the book, you already know that like my favorite thing is to trick. And I think that
it is.
and I think that my favorite trick so far has been a very meta trick where I want people to believe they're reading a science fiction book that then like I tell them, then you discover it's actually written like a murder mystery and you should have been paying attention to clues. But also you may be reading a science fiction franchise that is actually a fantasy franchise and you're going to figure it out too late. But no, I think that the genre thing is really interesting. So for me, the path is I had a really great person who was invested in my story and not the market. So there were points when it's like, yeah, she could have told me, no, hit it way harder on the genre, like hit it way harder, make it more like Blake Crouch, like really do this and then we'll have a market. No, she was protective of my vision for it as being an amorphous thing, even knowing the difficulties and informing me the difficulties that would take on to market. So I think it's really like, it takes a village to raise a baby. It took like a village to get this book to market, where it's people who understood and then having editors who do the same, following your gut with editors who I have been so incredibly fortunate. My first editor on this book was one of the only women of color editors I think that I have gotten to work with, Angeline Rodriguez. And so it's just, there was like an understanding and like a way of treating the things that were important to me as important to her as well when we did our first kind of read throughs. And then Sarah Pete after her, like all of these different things where it's like these people who are invested in your story, not necessarily like the market. Obviously they're sensible about both. They're going to try and get everybody paid. And that's also wonderful. But just that idea of not kind of having people who respect that vision was, I think, the most important thing. Because I could see, like, for me, I was one of those people that was just so grateful to even get an agent that I probably would have been like what if I have to do this, then I have to do this. Like, I don't know. You're completely kind of at the mercy of these people. And you've dreamt your whole life, if you're like me, of like being a writer and having a book on the shelf and getting to see it. And so you're in this very vulnerable position. And so that is something that is very real. So really having people around you whose instincts you trust and who you can trust to take your kind of thing. It's the only way I think you can take this not obviously marketable product that then became like quite marketable. Like it did fine. It's doing fine. But it was just with a lot of people like keeping the faith in what it was in its actual form and not trying to mold it into the next blank.
What about before you were agented?
Oh, yes. Oh, so that's kind of a similar thing. So I'm very much like raised on Toni Morrison. And so if you read Toni Morrison, they'll never call her anything but literary fiction. But there will be a ghost and there will be random crows that show up and there will be magic and we're going to set people on fire and it's fine. So that kind of, and Helen Oyame is I think is another one who, oh, the writing's really good, so you must be literary. We're just going to
Helen Oyame is one of my favorite writers.
But Toni Morrison and Helen have in common is this: we're going to do some weird stuff, but we're going to do it so well, you're going to come along. Like it's going to be weird and it's going to get super meta, like Mr. Fox. It's going to get strange, but you're going to come along and you're going to be delighted the whole time. And they do not care if it's going to make sense that there is a ghost. They do not care if it's going to make sense that this person might be magic and this person like might be talking to themselves and have gone through a weird body transformation. You're going to go through with it because it's going to be a beautiful, wonderful journey and you will learn about the world and yourself. And so that kind of thing where it's like, trust your reader to trust you a little bit. To go with you when things get weird. And so that's the lesson I think they both hold that I kind of took up, where it's like, it's going to get weird and maybe it won't be very, it won't have a lot of genre fidelity, but trust the reader to enjoy the ride enough to stick along with that when it's not following the formula that maybe feels comfortable. So reading those kinds of texts were my kind of prep, where it's just like, well, if they can do it, then maybe I can do it. Whereas if I'd strictly read much more formulaic stuff, I would have felt much more pressure to perform in that way.
And so my last question is, when's the movie option? When's the TV spinoff? When,
I don't know, man. You
because
tell me.
everything was so like cinematically clear. And it wasn't so detailed that my imagination couldn't have my own Ashtown, my own Wiley, my own view of these things. I was just able to kind of, like you said, like put together an amalgamation of all the sites that I've been to, right? And think about the world in that way, right? Like it's already happening, it's already around us. We just have this relationship with it where it's tied to the present instead of being reflective of the future. And I could just see this, right? I could see it as a TV show. As a series. I could see it as like almost like a future, like a fabulous like Game of Thrones, right? type format, or see it as a movie. And I'm so happy to hear you say that it's doing well, because it is definitely worth all of that. How would you feel if that opportunity came along? And like I said, has it? Because it should.
I hope so. My one big hope is, if I were going to imagine a film, not that I ever do that while I'm like staring in the mirror or anything, that'd be ridiculous. But if I were gonna imagine the film, I would just hope that they do not mess up the casting. Like, we picked her on the cover for a reason. And also I would hope, I mean, there are sex workers in my book that are deliberately and painstakingly portrayed not better than they are, but like really as contributing to society in a way that they do, and they simply do. And in science fiction, they love like, oh, these like weird saloony brothel types. They love to make sex workers the butt of the joke. And so if there's adaptation,
Scarlett Johansson. Someone just said no, Scarlett.
No.
She cannot play Dell. She cannot play
No.
the, Asian Wiley character. She cannot do that.
We can give her Sasha or something. But I would just hope that would maintain, is that the respect that I tried so hard to put in this text for the sex workers would not then be turned into sensationalized, like all of Game of Thrones. I would want it to stay in that kind of vein. So I guess really nervous. Like, please run me my movie check, but also I'm so scared if it got made. There's so much stuff. I'm just like, oh, there's so many things that I included that could then go poorly.
I mean, Exley, and I know we're out of time. Exley is one of my favorite characters. I love the protagonist, but Exley, they were my character. They were my character. But
there will be more Exley, just FYI.
Yes. Okay, sorry. Thank you everyone for being so participating, sending in questions.
That went so fast.
Yes, thank you. I know it's over. We appreciate you so much. Come back when the next book comes out. You'll be back because we'll want to talk to you about it. I could talk to you about this forever. But we want to say goodnight to everyone. Have beautiful weekends, and I hope you get everything that you need until we see each other again. Good night.